The guns had finally fallen silent. But the greatest defeat in Imperial Japan's history was only beginning. On the deck of the USS Missouri, an empire built on conquest, sacrifice, and absolute obedience was about to disappear forever. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of World War II, subscribe for more documentary-style history. Now, let's witness the day an empire came to its end. September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. Dawn came in a thin gray wash over the anchored fleet, over steel holes and signal flags and the damp teak deck of the battleship Missouri. The air smelled of salt, paint, oil, and rain not yet fallen. Around the ship, hundreds of Allied vessels stood motionless, as if history itself were holding its breath. Then the small figures of the Japanese delegation approached, black-coated, stiff, diminished beneath the towering guns. One envoy, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, moved with a cane. It clicked against the deck with a dry, deliberate sound, fragile beneath the weight of empires. For years earlier, Imperial Japan had struck across the Pacific with the confidence of a rising sun and the language of destiny. Now its representatives climbed toward a table set not for negotiation but for acknowledgement. Before them lay a document of 8 short paragraphs, and beyond that paper lay burned cities, empty rice bowls, shattered armies, and a nation that had discovered, too late, that myth cannot stop steel, fire, hunger, or time. This was not merely a surrender ceremony. It was the funeral of an imperial idea. And somewhere far from the immaculate deck, in the alleys of Tokyo and Osaka and Nagasaki, there was still no smell of warm rice in the air, no abundance, no comfort, only the memory of scarcity. That absence matters, because what ended in Tokyo Bay was not simply military resistance. It was a whole worldview built on sacrifice without limit, obedience without question, and conquest mistaken for salvation. The empire died before witnesses, but its true defeat had begun long before the ink touched paper. To understand why that quiet morning mattered, one must look backward across the long arc of the Pacific War, to the moment when Japanese expansion ceased to be a tide and became a retreat. At Midway in June 1942, Japan lost the strategic initiative. Britannica notes that Midway, together with Guadalcanal, ended the threat of further Japanese invasion in the Pacific and brought the naval struggle toward parity. From then on, the empire that had advanced with astonishing speed began to bleed strength it could not replace. American industry, shipyards, oil, carriers, aircraft, and logistics formed a kind of modern abundance beyond anything Tokyo could match. The imbalance was not only military, it was civilizational. As the war continued, American forces did not merely fight forward across islands. They built a system of inexhaustible pressure, submarines strangling shipping, bombers extending range, fleets replacing losses faster than Japan could measure them. By 1945, the empire still held millions of men on the Asian mainland, but possession was becoming illusion. Japan's cities and industries were being reached, then burned, then broken. The very language of the Allied ultimatum at Potsdam reflected that asymmetry. Japan, it said, was being given an opportunity to end this war, but if it refused, the full application of our military power would bring the inevitable and complete destruction of the Japanese armed forces and the utter devastation of the Japanese homeland. Yet in the same declaration lay another, less expected promise. We do not intend that the Japanese shall be enslaved as a race or destroyed as a nation, and freedom of speech, of religion, and of thought would be established. This contrast, between overwhelming force and a stated political future beyond annihilation, would prove central to Japan's final transformation. The Americans were offering not mercy in the sentimental sense, but a new order after defeat. In that offer stood the first outline of the world that would replace empire. But Imperial Japan in 1945 was not yet prepared to believe such words. Its rulers still clung to Ketsu-Go, this decisive operation, a plan rooted not in realistic victory but in the hope of making victory too expensive for the enemy. As the National World War II Museum records, Japanese leaders knew their military position was dark, yet rejected surrender and chose a strategy designed to inflict such horrific casualties on an American invasion force that Washington might accept a negotiated peace and spare the imperial order. By August, Japan had swollen its armed strength from about 4.5 million to over 6 million men, and in March had called up virtually every male from 15 to 60 and every female from 17 to 40, creating an immense reserve of combatants, many without uniforms, many barely trained, all folded into the logic of national emulation. A senior U.S. Army Air Force intelligence officer, seeing this reality, wrote in July 1945, "There are no civilians in Japan." That statement was not simply propaganda. It was a grim recognition that Japan had blurred the boundary between soldier and subject so completely that invasion promised a nightmare in which entire populations might fight, flee, burn, or die together. And many Japanese had been taught to expect something equally apocalyptic from the Americans. On Saipan, the military indoctrinated civilians to believe that capture meant atrocity and extermination. Several thousand chose suicide rather than surrender, and roughly 13,000 of about 20,000 Japanese civilians on the island perished. The empire had educated its people to fear the enemy more than death and to regard surrender as spiritual extinction. That is the emotional center of Japan's final defeat. Its soldiers expected a last sacred battle, and its civilians expected violation, enslavement, or slaughter. What many would actually experience after August 1945 was humiliation, yes, but also disarmament, survival, food relief, and the slow, bewildering arrival of political freedoms their leaders had described as foreign poison. The battle that made those expectations terrifyingly plausible was Okinawa. Just 350 miles south of Kyushu, the island was regarded as a vital precursor to any invasion of the home islands. Britannica calls it one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, the Typhoon of Steel, claiming more than 12,000 American lives and 100,000 Japanese lives, while at least 100,000 civilians were killed in combat were ordered by the Japanese military to commit suicide. Here, in April, May, and June of 1945, the future of Japan was previewed in mud, caves, phosphorites, kamikaze strikes, and mass death. The Japanese garrison fought from fortified positions with the very methods later envisioned for homeland defense: depth, concealment, reverse slopes, caves, night movement, attrition. American planners read the lesson clearly. If this was Okinawa, what would Kyushu be? Naval planners and the U.S. Sixth Army projected appalling losses for Operation Olympic and the broader Operation Downfall. The Naval History and Heritage Command records estimates ranging from 156,000 to 175,000 battle casualties for a 90-day Kyushu campaign, while later War Department estimates for the full invasion rose as high as 1.7 to 4 million U.S. casualties, including 400,000 to 800,000 dead and 5 to 10 million Japanese dead. At the same time, air war was turning Japanese cities into furnaces. On the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, 334 B-29s attacked Tokyo in Operation Meeting House. Britannica describes the firestorm as killing at least 80,000 people, likely more than 100,000, in a single night, leaving some 1 million homeless and destroying almost 16 square miles of the city in what the Japanese later called the Night of the Black Snow. This was the condition of the empire before Hiroshima. One path led to invasion and millions of dead, the other to continue bombing and starvation. The decisive battle the Japanese military had imagined was no longer heroic in form. It was administrative, statistical, mechanical, calculated in tonnage, calories, shipping losses, and projected corpses. Then came the ultimatum from Potsdam, and with it one of the most revealing moral juxtapositions of the war. On July 26, 1945, the United States, Great Britain, and China called on Japan to surrender its armed forces unconditionally. The declaration warned that the alternative was prompt and utter destruction, but it also promised that disarmed Japanese soldiers would be allowed to return home and lead peaceful and productive lives, that the Japanese people would not be enslaved as a race or destroyed as a nation, and that democratic tendencies would be strengthened until a peacefully inclined and responsible government had been established in accordance with the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. These were not ornamental phrases. They stood in direct opposition to the ideological architecture of the empire. Japanese militarism had demanded obedience to hierarchy, the sanctity of conquest, and the submergence of the individual in state destiny. Potsdam answered with occupation, disarmament, trade, rights, and political consent. Yet to many in Tokyo, surrender under such terms still seemed less tolerable than national ruin. The National World War II Museum's account of the internal crisis shows how divided the leadership remained even after Hiroshima. 3 members of the Big Six favored accepting the declaration with the preservation of the imperial institution. The other 3 demanded additional terms including self-disarmament, Japanese-run war crimes trials, and no occupation. Beneath the debate lay a desperate hope that some fragment of the old order might survive intact. Even in catastrophe, the empire wanted not simply to live, but to remain itself. That was the final illusion. For the document confronting Japan did not ask the empire to negotiate the shape of defeat. It asked the empire to stop existing as the principle by which Japan lived. Hiroshima shattered that illusion physically on August 6. According to the Atomic Heritage Foundation, the city held roughly 280,000 to 290,000 civilians and 43,000 soldiers. About 80,000 were killed instantly or seriously wounded, and between 90,000 and 166,000 are believed to have died within 4 months. A uranium bomb with a yield of roughly 12 to 15 kilotons destroyed about 60,000 of Hiroshima's 90,000 buildings. Still, even this did not immediately end the war. On August 8, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. On August 9, roughly 1.5 million Red Army troops surged into Manchuria, the jewel in the crown of Japan's colonial empire. That same day, Boxcar dropped the plutonium bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki at 11:02 a.m. The National World War II Museum states that the 21-kiloton blast annihilated everything within a mile, burned 14,000 homes, killed perhaps 40,000 people immediately, and by early 1946 had claimed roughly 30,000 more. The Atomic Heritage Foundation gives immediate deaths of 40,000 to 75,000 as total deaths by the end of 1945 may have reached 80,000. 3 shocks now converged in less than a week: an unprecedented weapon, the collapse of Japan's diplomatic hopes with Moscow, and the sudden destruction of the Guangdong position on the mainland. The National World War II Museum's account of Hirohito's decision is particularly revealing. In contemporary statements, the emperor cited 3 reasons for ending the war: loss of faith in Ketsu-Go because of the discrepancy between plans and performance, the devastation of conventional and nuclear bombing, and the worsening domestic situation. In his public broadcast he spoke of a new and most cruel bomb, whose power was incalculable, and confessed that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. This was imperial language drained of imperial certainty. Beneath the formality, one hears a ruler admitting what ideology had forbidden him to say, that courage had not matched production, spirit had not matched science, and sacrifice had not matched abundance. In the midnight hours of August 9th to 10th, the Japanese leadership reached the edge of the abyss and could go no further. The Imperial Conference met with the Big Six deadlocked. Army Chief of Staff Umezu still insisted Soviet entry was unfavorable, but did not nullify Ketsu-Go. Others, especially those closest to the emperor, understood that the state itself was beginning to fail, from the skies above, from the sea lanes below, and from the empty cupboards at home. Hiroshima spoke of the deteriorating domestic situation, especially food supplies. Then Hirohito did something almost unthinkable within the political culture of wartime Japan. He broke the deadlock himself and supported acceptance of the Allied terms with the single condition concerning the throne. The emperor later told his people that to continue the war would mean the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation and perhaps the total extinction of human civilization. He chose, in the phrase that would echo across the shattered country, to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. That language has often been remembered as resignation. It was more than that. It was the moment when the sacred vocabulary of imperial endurance was turned against the imperial war itself. Endurance no longer meant holding islands, expanding divisions, or sending boys into suicide attacks. It meant surviving defeat. Even that decision nearly failed. The National Museum of the Pacific War recounts how the Emperor's surrender announcement was pre-recorded and hidden because military diehards might try to stop it, and in fact young officers launched a coup attempt on the night before the broadcast, storming the Imperial Palace and searching for the recording while others moved against advocates of peace. The coup collapsed. At noon on August 15th, for the first time in history, Japanese subjects heard the Emperor's voice over the radio. He did not use the plain word, surrender. Monarchs seldom bury their empires in ordinary language. But the meaning was unmistakable. The war was over. The empire had not won the final battle. It had refused it. And so the cane tapped across the deck of the Missouri, and the long theater of imperial destiny ended not in a final cavalry charge or a volcanic last stand, but in signatures. We, acting by command of and in behalf of the Emperor of Japan, the document began, preserving the throne even as it extinguished the power exercised in its name. Then came the sentence at the heart of the ceremony. We hereby proclaim the unconditional surrender to the Allied powers of the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters and of all Japanese armed forces and all armed forces under Japanese control wherever situated. It was 9:04 in the morning when the Japanese envoys signed. General Douglas MacArthur accepted the surrender on behalf of the principal Allied powers and the other United Nations at war with Japan. The setting matters. This was done not in the ruins of Tokyo, not in a palace, and not on Japanese soil, but on an American battleship in Tokyo Bay, an image of sea power, industry, and strategic patience made iron. The empire that had once dreamed of destroying the U.S. Pacific Fleet had ended the war beneath the shadow of an American gun turret. Yet even here the emotional contrast remained profound. Many Japanese soldiers had expected that surrender would bring extermination or enslavement, because their own state had taught them to believe that the enemy was monstrous and that capitulation erased personhood. Instead, the formal terms of surrender folded into the broader Potsdam promise that Japan would not be destroyed as a people. Defeat would be absolute, national extinction would not. That distinction may sound bureaucratic to modern ears. In August and September 1945, it was revolutionary. The old regime had justified endless sacrifice by claiming it alone protected the nation from humiliation and annihilation. When the nation survived its defeat, when the sky did not fall, when disarmament did not become race extermination, when the empire died but the people remained, the moral authority of militarism was wounded beyond repair. What followed is where the symbolism of bread enters the story. During the war, abundance had belonged to the enemy, to its convoys, factories, canned rations, fuel, and endless replacements. Japan, by contrast, moved toward hunger. Post-war American policy was not simple benevolence. The U.S. sought to prevent starvation, disease, and unrest that might obstruct occupation aims. Yet the effect on lived experience was real and immense. A 1946 Foreign Relations of the United States document states that civilian food policy in Japan aimed to prevent starvation and widespread disease and civil unrest, while insisting that Japan redirect its resources to peaceful living. General MacArthur, remembered chiefly as conqueror, also became a manager of survival. World Food Program USA records that as conditions worsened he ordered an extensive child feeding program, implemented with the Japanese government beginning in 1947 and expanded nationwide by 1951, reaching 7 million children with school meals. Nippon.com's History of Japanese School Lunches notes that from 1946, with assistance from the United States and others, bread and powdered skimmed milk were provided in school lunches. The first standard post-war meal could be little more than tomato stew and reconstituted powdered milk, and by 1950 full meals with bread, milk, and side dishes were being served twice a week to many children. That bread roll, plain, soft, foreign, became more than food. It was a recurring object in the new Japan, a small item of contradiction to wartime doctrine. The empire had promised glory and delivered ashes. The occupier had arrived in warships and bombers, yet the daily emblem many children came to know was bread at a school desk. For soldiers returning home disarmed and dazed, for mothers who had heard the all clear and then the bomb, for children who had known black markets and ration lines. A piece of bread could express something no rescript ever had, that power might also field, that authority might choose stability over vengeance, that the victorious democracy across the ocean possessed not only the means to destroy but the means to sustain. That is why the final defeat that ended the Japanese Empire was more than a military collapse. It was a conversion by evidence. The evidence of Okinawa taught that Ketsu-Go meant national butchery. The evidence of Tokyo's firestorm taught that the homeland was no sanctuary. The evidence of Hiroshima and Nagasaki taught that science had altered the scale of destruction. The evidence of Soviet entry taught that diplomacy had failed and time had run out. The evidence of Potsdam taught that the enemy intended to end militarism without erasing the Japanese people. And the evidence of the occupation, messy, unequal, strategic, human, taught ordinary Japanese that life after surrender was not the apocalypse they had been promised. None of this erased grief. Cities remained graveyards. Radiation lingered. Prisoners mourned. Veterans returned to absence. Families waited for men who would never walk through the door. But ideology had suffered a fatal humiliation. It had demanded death as proof of loyalty, and then history had shown that survival required disobedience to that demand. In that sense, the empire was not merely beaten from outside. It was unmade from within by the collapse of its own claims. When Hirohito said the nation must keep pace with the progress of the world, he was admitting, in ceremonial language, that the imperial road had led to isolation from reality itself. The larger truth is almost painfully simple. Freedom is not only a banner or a constitution or a victorious speech. Sometimes it first appears in the modest forms that empires do not understand: the right to go home after disarmament, the right to speak and think without ritual obedience, the right to feed children before feeding myths, the right to choose peace over sacred ruin. On the deck of the Missouri, an empire signed away its war. In the classrooms and ration lines of the years that followed, another Japan began to sign away its old faith. And there, on a tray before a hungry child, lay the recurring symbol of that transformation: not a sword, not a chrysanthemum, not a flag in the sun, but bread, ordinary bread, soft enough to tear by hand, abundant enough to share, and humble enough to suggest that the strongest answer to a cult of death may be the quiet, democratic miracle of enough. And the evidence of the occupation, messy, unequal, strategic, human, taught ordinary Japanese that life after surrender was not the apocalypse they had been promised. None of this erased grief. Cities remained graveyards. Radiation lingered. Prisoners mourned. Veterans returned to absence. Families waited for men who would never walk through the door. But ideology had suffered a fatal humiliation. It had demanded death as proof of loyalty, and then history had shown that survival required disobedience to that demand. In that sense, the empire was not merely beaten from outside. It was unmade from within by the collapse of its own claims. When Hirohito said the nation must keep pace with the progress of the world, he was admitting, in ceremonial language, that the imperial road had led to isolation from reality itself. The larger truth is almost painfully simple. Freedom is not only a banner or a constitution or a victorious speech. Sometimes it first appears in the modest forms that empires do not understand: the right to go home after disarmament, the right to speak and think without ritual obedience, the right to feed children before feeding myths, the right to choose peace over sacred ruin. On the deck of the Missouri, an empire signed away its war. In the classrooms and ration lines of the years that followed, another Japan began to sign away its old faith. And there, on a tray before a hungry child, lay the recurring symbol of that transformation: not a sword, not a chrysanthemum, not a flag in the sun, but bread, ordinary bread, soft enough to tear by hand, abundant enough to share, and humble enough to suggest that the strongest answer to a cult of death may be the quiet, democratic miracle of enough.